Give us a little brief presentation.
Alrighty, how's everyone doing?
Hey!
Welcome everyone, and thank you. On behalf of the panel, I'm really happy to be part of this group. I was looking at everyone's backgrounds before this, and it's a really amazing group of folks. So I think the discussion is going to be very fruitful for everybody, and I know from meeting a few of you out there that there's a lot of perspectives in here that will be beneficial. So of course, all the questions will be well received. Very quickly on who we are, you can call us Unfido or Unfido, it doesn't matter. We're an identity verification company, so we help companies onboard new users. We help bring a legal identity into the digital world by scanning driver's licenses and IDs and matching it to a biometric. We do this through machine learning AI. We have a very technological approach to what we do because it's a global problem. There's lots and lots of IDs around the world and lots of cultures of people, and of course lots of fraudsters with a business model that are trying to beat our system. So it's a very challenging problem, but we think of it as the first step in an identity lifecycle. The whole point of doing this is to give people access to services, and many of you provide these great services out there that have communities that rely on trust or have regulatory concerns of preventing money laundering. There's different reasons for having these types of services, but ultimately once you go through this step and create an account, you want to give people access to their service and very conveniently be able to access that each day. So we look at that as sort of the identity life cycle. Our customers are our partners in many ways because we're going into a new era of identity. I think with the model, and I've been in the space for about 20 years, for better or for worse, and have seen lots of changes in this industry. You know, I think all of us have seen our information compromised in a pretty bad way, and we're going to explore that in some of the questions. And so the question really as an ecosystem here is, how do we improve this identity system, make it more secure, respect our privacy, but bring this absolute thing of convenience to all of us lazy humans. And that's the fine balance of any security system that we need to design. So hopefully the panel will explore all the dimensions of this. We got some great topics to set up and discuss. And again, thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. And Yasmin is actually an attorney here at Shepherd Mullen, and she's sponsoring tonight with drinks. And do you want to say a few words about what you guys do?
Sure. Hi, I'm Yasmin, and I am an intellectual property attorney with Shepherd Mullen. I'm also the co-lead of our blockchain and cryptocurrency industry team. And I wanted to say thank you to our panelists and for all of you joining us tonight. We have these events about twice a month, and it alternates between this office and our Silicon Valley office. So if you would like to get on the email list, just let us know, and hopefully we'll see you at more events. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. So I'll pass it over to Mark. Mark is a journalist, and he's going to moderate tonight, and he's going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Pimo. Kevin did a great job of kind of laying the landscape for this, so there's not much more I can add to that. So let's get right into it. Let's have each of you begin just by briefly introducing yourselves and the work that you do or the companies you're associated with. Pierre, why don't you start?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Pierre Wolf, and I work with a company named InCountry. InCountry is focused on enabling SaaS providers to localize their data in countries where there's regulatory requirements to do so. Today we operate in about 60 countries, and we deal in regulated data only, which is usually personal data, employee data, health data, financial data, and payments data specifically.
Hi, I'm Mark Straub. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Smile Identity. At Smile Identity, we try to make it easy for people to prove who they are, regardless of the origin of their ID card or their IP address. We've started in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we've built relationships and integrations into various national ID systems, as well as relationships with a wide variety of FinTechs, banks, telecoms that are trying to onboard new users, as well as re-authenticate those users during the user's journey. We combine face recognition with ID validation, and so we essentially can do a stronger KYC on somebody in Lagos, Nigeria than you can do in Los Angeles. We do this by requesting that a user provide a selfie, as well as an ID number that's local and relevant for that market. And then in the background, we query the national ID system or the other ID system, look at the photo that's on file inside that system, and do face recognition between the user-provided selfie and the government photo. And so we don't even care about physical credentials. We sort of moved beyond the idea of trying to catch a fake ID, and instead are really focused on proving true identity in the moment for a user as they're starting a new journey with a product. And we have been around for about 3 years, and very excited to be here on this panel. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Philip Shoemaker. I'm the Executive Director of Identity.com. Identity.com started as the Civic Marketplace. It was a division of a piece of Civic, the for-profit company that's focused on decentralized digital identities. Some people call it self-sovereign identity. But the idea is you store things like an attestation, somebody that attests to your ID being valid, being correct. And that's stored up on the blockchain, but you have complete sovereignty over it on your own device. But the idea was we are a 501c4 nonprofit. We're spinning it out of Civic right now. And the idea is to create a marketplace where validators such as Onfido, as well as requesters, they could be anybody that needs to get a digital identity, like an Airbnb or an Apple or something like that, to be able to get together, code to one API, and be able to leverage different validations whenever they like. And what this allows, it helps drive down the pricing for this to allow anybody to get a digital ID and have it secure and safe, because it's controlled by you.
My name is Nuno Gonçalves Pedro. I'm an investor, early stage investor, founder and managing partner of Strive Capital. At Strive, we mostly focus on the consumer software, enterprise software as a service spaces. We've done a couple of investments in the blockchain space and around deep tech, AI, early stage apps and platforms. And because I have plenty of time on my hands, I'm also a venture partner with Christian Robotics, and we're a Central Growth Fund focused mostly on hard tech, companies that you might have heard about, like Spin that sold to Ford, Ring that sold to Amazon, and a couple of those plays. And I've been working on identity-related issues against all the odds since 2004, when I was in the telco world and we were trying to see if the telcos could play I would say a positive role in that. Unfortunately, that hasn't evolved dramatically, and that's about it.
Kevin?
I think I'm good.
You're good, okay. Well, let's get right into it then. So what I'm curious about, and some of you already touched on it in your introductions, there's lots of great opportunity out there. There's lots of things that can serve for digital identity, but we aren't there yet. I mean, we're just not even a fraction of the way there yet. So what's holding this space back right now in your view? What's the, how can you cross the chasm, and what will it take to get there?
For me, it's all about the three things. I talk about this a lot. There's fear, there's friction, and there's infrastructure. As far as supporting something like a digital ID, I know you guys are working on an ID when you don't necessarily have a smartphone or necessarily a connection. And I think that's one of the issues that we have with infrastructure in general with digital IDs, is that I can go to any bar, show them my ID, and it'll be fine, because they don't necessarily need to have any sort of infrastructure to support looking at a physical card. But showing a complete stranger my physical card is crazy to me. I mean, I've done it my entire life, but looking back, I realize how stupid that is. Because now they have all my information, they know where I live, etc. And a lot of stuff can happen from that. And so for me, the fear is around people supporting something new, some new digital thing, asking someone to scan their driver's license or their passport with their phone and an app is crazy to a lot of people. They look at you twice and they don't want to do that. So fear is one piece, infrastructure just being able to support that, and then friction, just yet add another a level of I don't want to say torture, but friction to be able to get into your social network, etc. Just makes it really difficult. I think that's some of the issues.
For me, there's a trifecta that we always talk about identity as a sort of self-defining piece, right? But in my opinion, and again, I'm probably the least expert person in this panel, there is sort of a trifecta that rounds this up, which is identification, authentication, authorization, right? And I think a lot of the issues exist because there are different animals in play here. For example, the authentication issue, which you were alluding to, which is I get your card and I can use your card to, for example, if I have your social security number in the US, I can do all sorts of things. But that's not true in other parts of the world. It's not true that by one number, magically, you can do all sorts of things. So I think there is a dimension, for example, on authentication, how you authenticate yourself to the world and what is done around it, that actually is not fully solved. And that's in some ways the problem with this. It's actually a very complex issue. It's not just about who I am or who I say I am. In some cases, I actually don't want to identify myself to the world, right? I am anonymous. For example, I was on the board of a gay social network called Hornet. You know, I want to identify myself, but I don't want, for example, the government of Russia to know who I am, right? That's sort of a problem. So in some ways, what I see here is really an element of complexity that gets added through digital and through the fact that communications, mobility, etc., get very, they basically enrich this dimension of identity, and we need to be really then very careful in how we protect it. I won't talk about privacy just yet, but I think that's the extra element that adds to it. But for me, that's what happens with identity. There's all these complexity that we're not really solving for at this stage.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And I think if you think about what digital identity is, we're starting to try to take these representations of relationships and now put them into the digital domain. And in the physical world, we've known in the past that there are times when you are your true self, and there are times when you're anonymous or pseudonymous. And for consumers, they don't always want to disclose, who they are and share all of their personal information. But there are other moments when, let's say that they're in a social network and they want to know that everyone else that they're interacting with is either someone they know or someone who's verified. You could also have a pseudonymous situation where I don't necessarily need to know who you are, but I need to know that you've been verified, that some amount of information about you has been verified. Maybe in Airbnb, for example, I don't need to know your address, but I need to know that Airbnb knows your address, right? And so this kind of layered onion of identity is complicated, and making that really easy for consumers is tricky. And so I think there's some good analogies tonight, but I think about if you go back in time to when e-commerce was sort of just emerging on the internet, it was pretty flimsy. It was Beanie Babies and and Pez dispensers. It was sort of like the first e-commerce marketplaces in some ways, and pet food, right? And then we evolved to Amazon, and then you think about mobile payments, and mobile payments initially was ringtones and screen, like wallpaper for your mobile screen. And now we have extremely sophisticated mobile payments. So I think we're just on a journey here, and there's a consumer education piece that has to go along, but that has to be met alongside with really good UX. User experiences either on the phone or other surfaces that we're interacting with. And that's something that just innovators and consumers and privacy advocates kind of have to get enough time, enough experience to get us to that point.
Pierre, do you want to chime in?
Kevin mentioned being in the industry for 20 years, and I think as somebody who's been in it for 20 years, this has been an issue since the 90s even, early 90s. And so, to build on your thing, authentication is really the biggest challenge in all of this. And the identification piece it will take on a lot of other baggage. For example, we have to get governments to begin to recognize and regulators to recognize that certain data is allowed to come in these different manners. When you look at for example, in the case of authentication, whether we talk about biometrics or other things, the relying parties are also an important component here. We keep trying to talk about digital identity like a holistic problem, but really it is a problem that gets broken down depending on the use case. And so relying parties for getting a passport are very different than those for buying music on the internet, or even for me to validate myself to somebody that I'm a reliable person who has babysat before. So I think that this is again, the complexity issue. The reason we're having this panel and we're able to talk about this is because it is very complex and has been so for 20 plus years. So.
Kevin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, those are all great points. You were kind of hitting the point about, I think the problem we have to deal with is that we don't want to use a government-based system because we don't trust them protecting our data or getting too much information about ourselves as consumers. But the best system in the world has been derived by a government-based ID that we use. You just described it. So that always holds us back. And then I think your point you just made about use cases, we try to build a system that can work everywhere, across every country. It's never going to go that way, right? There's no single ID. It's going to be something that's regional, like your company, working country by country, state by state, but like you said, use case by use case. If we can build those, that's a huge win. Then worry about the bigger, longer thing 20, 30 years down the road, because I think we get trapped by this enormity of the problem and trying to solve it all, and if we can't get there, we stop. And then it just, like, everyone gets kind of like discouraged. And so I think that's where it's kind of started and stopped over the years. And it truly is going to be an industry solution that has to have the ecosystem work to make it work. But we got to start small in pieces, I believe, to make it build up over years, not just going for the big win at the end, beginning.
Well, I want to bridge from one of your comments about government, Kevin, because government has traditionally owned identity. I mean, passports and driver's licenses, and this is their domain, and you're trying to disrupt them now. So what's the regulatory climate look like? I mean, are you seeing some thawing? Is there room for dialogue? Can you overcome whatever hurdles they put up? Can you give us a sense of the temperature right now and what you're facing in regards to this issue? Who wants to take that first?
I think as long as there's actual citizenship as part of us living in this world, governments will have a significant imposition, which I think is a very valid one, through the emission of passports, ID cards, whatever the format might be. So I don't think they can be out of the equation, right, unless somehow magically the world becomes a non-citizen type world. So I think they need to be in it, and I think from your solutions, from what I can see, many cases you base yourselves on government documentation, right? My license, my passport, etc. So I think it's unavoidable. There is definitely a role. I think the issue has been that government hasn't really adopted the right mechanisms for digital identity. And the world is basically swarming. It's getting more and more digital identities. And we've been talking a lot about people, right? But obviously digital identities go beyond people. They go towards objects, they go towards all sorts of other things, right? So I think that's where governments have really failed. And now the question for me is, can the private sector, help? We haven't talked about, for example, the fact that things like Facebook Connect, at a certain point in time when everyone says, oh, there's no way in hell that we'll go past username and password and the email, binary solution, Facebook Connect took over, right? Now we realize maybe that was not a good thing. For other reasons, right? And now there's a pushback on that. But in some ways, I think that space will at some point be occupied by the private sector, but governments will need to regulate. There's no way in hell that we can be in a world that has citizenship and a bunch of other things where governments don't regulate certain aspects of identity. Again, identity is multi-layered, so it won't regulate everything, but it needs to regulate certain aspects of it.
I also think maybe we can move towards a world, the one of the non-citizenship or the global citizen, maybe a few decades or centuries out, depending on your perspective. But we can move towards a world where, yes, governments still issue foundational identities, but you maybe don't need always to use and show that foundational identity, across the journey of your life, right? You maybe only need that a few times, maybe when you're actually going to the airport. And maybe even we get to a point where you've got the ability to show a verified claim that this foundational identity was checked at one point in time, but now you can authenticate without having to repurpose or re-show or redisclose all of that personal information. So I think some of these newer solutions, and especially the more consumer-oriented ones that I think are going to be really interesting in the next couple of years, giving people essentially a digital locker, digital passport. A marketer will come up with a better name than what I've come up with. But essentially, for us, like your Smile ID, that you can then use, let's say, if you need to open up a credit account, a credit card account, if you want to open up a savings account, if perhaps you want to be able to stay in an Airbnb or go on a safari or do some sort of activity where it does matter that you've been verified, but I don't need to ask for all of your KYC information all over again.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess the first question I have is something we didn't cover, which is what exactly is a digital ID? But if we jump ahead and we look at what the government is currently doing. So yesterday I went through this amazing process to get a real ID through the DMV, and it was not easy, but at the same time, so it's using a digital technology, ID.me, to be able to help me go through this process much more quickly, if you will. But we look at that. So there are initiatives, and a lot of people a lot of governments are pushing through initiatives to support these digital IDs. And we look at Wyoming as a great example of a state that's doing a lot of work as far as business creation, right? Businesses will be registered in a digital way, and will be able to use those credentials to be able to authenticate yourself as a member of that company or as somebody that represents that company. And so we're seeing this move slowly. Now, will they be successful? It's we'll see what happens. But for me, I look at a lot of this stuff as what's going to happen when there's the end of the nation state. Now, I talk about this a lot because it's something that I see little signs here and there that show that it's coming ultimately, and digital identity is part of it. Mostly digital currency, right? Cryptocurrency. So for me, this may happen someday, but as long as we have governments, we need to have a government ID that's associated with us.
Anyone else want to talk about that? Well, I want to kind of switch gears now a little bit and kind of look at the user and what digital privacy means to them. I was in Redwood Shores last night covering an appearance by Microsoft President Brad Smith at the Churchill Club. And he told a very interesting anecdote about some reception that his wife went to. And there was someone there from Google who didn't know that she was Brad Smith's wife, and basically said, "You would not believe how much information we have about anyone in this room." I mean, this was someone from Google. So my question is, how much do we own our own identities? I mean, with all the digital information that's out there about all of us, and we all know it's out there, can we really truly own our own digital identity? Can we get there?
So I would back up a little bit because there's a lot in what you said. And one of the things that first comes up is this notion about the convolution of identity and this data. And then you bring up ownership. And so now we're talking about intellectual property and issues around ownership. These are all very different things. When I think about the identity, first of all, I like to step away from the identity term because my identity as a person is not digitally represented anywhere. What's represented is a bunch of data that people are making decisions as to how they will represent me. I am not a fan of the notion of I own my data because it's not mine. When Facebook tracks me going to various pages on their site, they're tracking it, it's their data. And how they choose to represent it is up to them. And if they gave me that data, I would still not know what to do with it. Because most of it is not in English language comprehensible data formats. It's in technical formats. Now the GDPR has been doing a really good job in trying to define what this data is and this data ownership is. And they're trying to put frameworks in place, but it's super complicated because again, all right, let's step back to the pre-internet days and say, when somebody followed me home and saw where I lived, did I own my data? Did they own my data? Has somebody stolen my data? I wouldn't even conceive of it in those terms. Okay. When somebody opened the phone book when I was a kid and looked up a phone number, did the phone company steal my data? Again, so I think what we're seeing happen in the digital world is that we've removed all the friction associated with getting all of this information in one place. And then we're using these algorithms to make decisions where nobody really understands what the algorithms do. So I think a lot of it is this, it's a difficult thing for us to penetrate with our minds. And people are using it for very specific uses, but we can see that the externality is that, boy, when you start to put one use on top of another, it gets out of hand really fast. So how will all this get regulated or thought through in a way that we all agree? And then look, then you break it out into each country's approach. How China deals with data is different than how Russia's dealing with it, than how India is dealing with it in the US. So now you've got this other thing happening. This is, again, I don't like to look at the ownership, and look, the privacy issues are also about this, not giving not giving my data to everybody. So I don't need to give you my license number, or sorry, my license to get into a bar because they don't need my number, which could be used in other ways. So, again, just hard.
Okay.
Yeah, I love the examples, the pre-internet examples, because they're very, they go back to first principles. But I do think, so the first principles, the retort to your example would be, you're right, you know, if I watch where your house is and I follow you home from the grocery store, no, that's probably not illegal, and that information I haven't stolen from you. However, if I hired 1,000 people to follow everybody in your town home every day from start to finish, I'd probably get arrested and charged with, you know, with being a public nuisance, right? I mean, I think in some towns in America, I don't think
you knew they were following you.
If you have every moment of your day being tracked everywhere you go, and that information is then, and that's happening not just to you, but like everyone in a particular space, you start to threaten the social contract, right? So the question is, what can we as a society, and not just we, but any given society, what can they tolerate and what will they tolerate? And I think these are democratic questions that have to get answered in politics, right? Not necessarily purely in private companies. But I do think that we as entrepreneurs and innovators need to be aware that when you track someone's behavior, when you aggregate all this information, when you build a database, you are stepping into the area of social contract. And I actually think that the right approach is to encourage thoughtful, well-intentioned regulation that's done in consultation with different stakeholders in the industry. And right now in the United States, unfortunately, you know, we're pretty far behind, I think, in terms of having that conversation like the Europeans are doing. Ironically, in Ghana, I mean, the Ghanaians were 5 years ahead of the Europeans. We're a licensed data processor in Ghana. We went through a process. We had to disclose all of our security practices. We had not all of our encryption, but at least the kinds of practices that we take. We had to basically sign a bunch of forms that committed to how we're going to handle people's data. We have a certification. They can audit us. They can ask us to do it every year if they want. I mean, the Ghanaians are further ahead in this than many states in the United States. So I do think that has to happen, and it needs to happen soon.
One thing I want to add is I think my sort of pessimistic answer is that for me and our generation, I think it's too late. And I think part of the problem is that we used the system when it was created without knowing the rules. And the businesses, I don't think, knew the rules. So our data not only was captured in the way you guys described so well, it was stored and then it was marketed. And unfortunately, it's now public in many ways. Like I've got posts from the early 90s when I was in college at Illinois and still there. You can see I traded Grateful Dead tapes when I was in college. All right, I'm guilty. And so what do? It's too late. So I look at it as now we know, and I look at our kids, I've got young kids, like it's got to be different for them. We've got to stop the problem from going forward. We got to relook at the systems. The social contract, I think, is a great word because I wasn't even aware it was going to happen, even as we move through it. And so how do I control it once it's already in the machine? And what has this led to? Equifax, yada, 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 place has been whacked, and Anthem, every aspect of my life is now compromised. What am I going to do? Control it? What am I controlling anymore? So I think the pressure now is don't repeat this for the next generation. Like these systems that we're building from scratch, do it right. And I think that's where it's hard to envision that without a government regulatory aspect to it.
Completely.
I just don't see it.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, as you said, the cat's out of the bag. You know, are we going to be able to get it back in? For me, I was blissfully ignorant for many years using the internet and putting information out there, etc. When I was running the App Store at Apple, we approved a bunch of apps that the Wall Street Journal ended up writing about, saying that these apps are tracking you, right? These apps are watching you. And that's when I started looking closely at the paths, at the Facebooks, at the LinkedIn. I'm the guy that approved every or rejected every app. And so for me, I realized at that point that I don't own my email address. I don't own my phone number. It's out there. The path shared it. Everybody shared it. It's out there. I know my social security numbers on the dark web. I've seen my driver's license on the dark web. I mean, it's out of the bag. I was blissfully ignorant for so long, and I was happy. But then, you know, I give out my phone number to people all the time. And yes, that used to be the same phone number that I would use to do 2FA on Coinbase and Gemini and others. And last year, oh yeah, I got hacked. And money started to disappear. I mean, it's one of those, when you get SIM jacked or SIM swapped, It's a nightmare. And so I don't know if this data is ever coming back, if I'm ever going to get it out of the bag, but I realized then and there that with the Path incident, this was 2012 or 13 or something, that I don't own my email address, and when I give my business card out to somebody, it's kind of like that old saying that when you sleep with someone, you slept with everybody they've ever slept with. When I give someone my business card, it goes to everyone they know. That's how I feel about it now, because I know I don't have any control over that, and suddenly I start getting spam and other things because people share my email address for some reason.
I agree with everything that's been said, so I'm not going to add to that dimension, but I think we're missing one other point, which is, and there's an element, I think, of control of data and authorization of data that's actually utility for us as human beings. You know, just very basic example, I lived in China for 6 years before I moved to the US. And when I come to the US, they're like, you have no credit scores. Like, how is that possible? I've had a credit card since I was 20, right? In Europe, I've had credit cards in Portugal, in the UK, in China. How do I not have a credit score, right? And I would like to authorize someone to go back to all my credit scoring everywhere and all my purchases and say, just go through it and you'll give me an amazing credit score, right? So there's actually an element of utility which is even worse than that. It's not just that our data sometimes is out there and we don't want it out there, but sometimes we want our data out there for someone to validate what we actually get out of it in terms of utility, and we can't, right? And that's something that's just fundamentally wrong in my mind. So again, I don't think it's about data ownership. I think you put it incredibly well. There's a, you know, what do we own, what we don't own, but there are certain elements of authorization and control that I think we should have that promote utility to us as well as human beings.
Go ahead.
Sorry, one other thing. So, you know, the other notion is that of the relying parties. So in your example, you know, if the relying parties are only relying on the domestic credit scoring system, then that's what they're doing. The question is, once things start to get compromised so badly, then are the relying parties relying on things that are not reliable, right? So I would challenge somebody who says, oh, we need to see your social security number, and say, why? Just go online, you can find it anywhere. It's in all these databases. In other words, it's not helpful. So they are holding to old monikers, and they're holding to old history. And I think where we need to help think through this problem is to say, hey, look, we got to figure out a new set of reliable data for the relying parties to be able to do transactions with us.
Yeah, you can hang on to that. I'm Mike here. So let's talk technology for a second. And no less an expert on privacy than Mark Zuckerberg himself was recently quoted in an interview describing how he's evaluating the use of the blockchain to let users gain direct access to services by passing a third party. My question is from your perspective, is this a good idea? I mean, is the blockchain a potential good solution for digital identity and verification?
Get some blockchain veterans here.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it to the blockchain guy. I'm just going to say, I don't believe it is, because the issue I see with identity is one of key management and the challenges of key management, not that the data is stored in the blockchain. So that would be the...
Okay, Philip?
Yeah, absolutely, it's ready. So what I'd say about it is that, look, I'm not a big fan of storing any sort of PII up on blockchain, right? Anything that identifies you personally, quantum computing is going to be able to break everything in just a matter of years. So for me, I'm not a huge fan of PII stored up there, but an attestation that redirects somebody to my phone, that sends a command to my phone to be able to progressively disclose my information, I don't have much of a problem with that. I think that's a pretty solid solution. So for me, it depends on what these services are. But I think it's an interesting use case, and it's something that we use significantly.
Anyone else?
I'll add just 2 cents to it.
Yeah, blockchain, I mean, it's a fancy word. It just means it's just a database technology. I remember when I was like working in venture and I was a young analyst.
I think you're going to get killed after that.
No, I don't mind.
It's a very novel, very clever, very useful new database technology that allows a lot of new types of things to happen because it's a distributed database, because you can have multiple entities reading and writing from that database, and you don't necessarily have to know who created the entry in the database. There's proof of work or other methods of verifying. But it's still a database technology, right? It doesn't solve, for example, key management. It doesn't necessarily solve authentication at the device level, or solve authentication, let's say, in a village where somebody's trying to get access to some public service benefit. So we actually, it's funny, I mean, for a while, the blockchain craze was sort of making its way into emerging markets, and every conference and every conversation would be like, well, do you guys use blockchain? The IFC was asking me if we use blockchain. I fell victim. I went to my co-founder, I was like, hey, I think we need to do something with blockchain. Everyone's asking about it. And he said, first let's talk about what it actually does, right? Which is this database technology. So I think, what Identity.com is doing with blockchain kind of is interesting. I think what Civic has done is interesting. But you still have to solve key management. And so that means solving either authentication using these devices or using biometrics, or you got to keep your key in a safe place. And blockchain doesn't solve that.
And I think it's an issue also of garbage in, garbage out, in the sense that if the first instance of this whole thing is a fake instance or a misappropriated instance, it's forever a misappropriated instance. I'm very bearish on blockchain. I always say that I'm in blockchain because I think it's going to be big in the future, but I'm bearish in it right now because the noise is just, obfuscating. I mean, forget the far west of the internet years of the early 90s. This is a different ballgame altogether. But there is something about it, and I think, I'm a strange person. I've spent a lot of my career working in technology, but I went away from being an engineer very early on, which may have not been the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, I think the interesting thing about blockchain, the way I see it in a very simplified manner, is there is an instance of business model creation through the creation of the crypto assets that actually allocate to the blocks, right? So in some ways, there is an element to it that is interesting, and I do think it goes beyond the sort of normal instance of databases. So again, being very bearish, I still would say there's value in it. It's a distributed system that will have valuable applications that we're still trying to figure out. And it's like we just came across TCP/IP with some embedded business model dynamics to it, and we're now like, oh my God, this is going to be huge, but we just have no clue of how this is going to be huge. It's going to be huge, right? And I think it's basically that. It's what we're going through right now in some ways.
But here's the thing with my challenge with blockchain is that if we think this identity space is hard, and all of the things we said about how hard this is, now imagine you layer on something where you have to create an incentive for people to maintain the blockchain. So if that company goes away or dies, yeah, it's in all these other places, but they have to have an incentive to do it. And it's not empathy. Much of the blockchain today is a lot of empathy conversations. When you talk private blockchain, it's very empathetic. Oh, we do it because we all have an interest, but it's like these 5 companies that control the whole thing. So I think that there are issues of consensus and governance that are still yet to be resolved in blockchain. And once they are figured out, I have a lot of hope for it, but it is a long way to get there.
I would allege the internet is still being figured out, and that's been around for a while. So what I would say again, I'm very short term, so I'm not going to be the blockchain guy here defending a bunch of stuff. And I've gone through a fair amount of ICOs myself, unfortunately, or fortunately. So let me rephrase that. But just to point the point, I think the technology has applications. That's my only point, and I do think those applications are very valid.
All right, well, we've kicked the blockchain around, but Mark raised another possible tech here, biometrics. So is that viable, perhaps more viable than the blockchain in regards to a good solution in this area?
Yeah, I think the future is multimodal. There's not one technology that sort of is the silver bullet. But if you think about the future of authentication being multi-layer, maybe something something you have, something you are. Biometrics plays an interesting role there. Biometrics is, remember, it's not perfectly binary like a password is, right? There's only one way to type in a password. But biometrics are always probability or probabilistic. So, but the nice thing and the neat thing about biometrics is it's extremely difficult to both know a password, have a device, look 99.8% the same as somebody else, and pass a proof of life check that's done through a randomized nonce or a randomized request. That sort of pattern is extremely difficult to beat, and certainly difficult to beat in a class hack. And so biometrics plays a really neat role in adding another lock essentially on doors, and doing it in a way that actually works whether you're in Silicon Valley or whether whether you're in Nairobi or in Cape Town. So that's one of the things we like about it.
One thing I'll add to it, I think it's a real-time technology, so that ultimately all this stuff is network-based or it's code-based, and ultimately I think, again, I think of myself as a well-breached individual, that you're gonna have to go back to me as an individual in real time to say it's me. That's all I got left. And I think the concern I've got generally is that if we go into this world and start to centralize that information or whatever it may be, there's no going back, obviously. You can maybe do the left side of your face or whatever, or a different finger, but we have that threshold of the deep end of the pool that if you go there, you're not coming out. But ultimately, I think it's a critical thing I don't think we have a choice. That's where I think we have to end up, because information is just information. And ultimately, I think it is the ultimate bridge of who I am. I'm here digitally as a representation of myself. And so I think not for every application, I'm talking more high assurance versus low assurance stuff. I can use an email or whatever it may be for low assurance. But for things that matter in this world, I think biometrics is going to be here for a long time.
Yeah, I think biometrics are super important, and I'm a big fan of them, but they have to, as you said, multimodal, right? To me, it's yet another factor that I am who I say I am. Well, I have a lot of conversations with the casino folks in Las Vegas that want to be able to identify you as soon as you walk through the door. And that's something that I am very opposed to, because I don't want the wind to know that I'm walking through. They probably already do. If you join one of their loyalty programs and get your picture taken, odds are as soon as you walk through one of those casinos, they know who you are. But I don't want to do that. I want it to ask me. I want my phone to pop up and say, hey, the wind wants to recognize that you're here. Are you okay with that? And show me the information that they want to be able to have access to. I feel much better when there's multiple approaches to this, and especially when it comes to something like biometrics, which we know are not infallible. We know that facial recognition is really bad, mostly with people of color, and that's a problem, right? As soon as we start running into those issues, we know that the DNA things can be spoofed. And there's a lot of issues there, and that's why you need multi-factor, multimodal approaches.
We're working on the last one you mentioned. I mean, this is actively something that we're working on. We have a PhD candidate from in Rwanda, from Carnegie Mellon, Kigali, who's working with our Stanford PhD, basically to specifically work on this issue of making face recognition better for people of color, making it more accurate, making it less false negatives, less false positives, and even handling difficult environmental conditions. So if you're in low lighting situation, or if you have a very weak camera, our latest SDK actually uses some very cool technology to overdrive the chart, basically overdrive the sensor on the phone to let more photons in, even if you got a dark situation, to basically still get a good image for that user. But the last thing you mentioned about the user having a say about whether biometrics are used, I didn't talk about this, but it's extremely important. I think what's going on in China right now with biometrics is incredibly scary. It's very dystopian. It's not something we would ever want to be involved in. I saw a news story maybe about a year and a half ago where the Chinese facilitated a trade deal between one of their face recognition companies and the Zimbabwean government. And basically it looks like the Zimbabwean government handed over their entire citizens' national ID system with all the face information to this Chinese government, to this Chinese company. And then a few weeks later, I started getting emails from Shanghai saying, "Are you interested in buying faces from Zimbabwe or these other countries?" And I shared it with my investor base because I was just livid. And we have a lot of investors and employees, obviously, from across the African continent. This is exactly what shouldn't be happening. So the way you fix that is you make consent a key part of the user journey. And so when we build face recognition, we're not building it for surveillance or live video capture. We're building it for in-the-moment, face-on or face pose-specific face recognition that's on a device and that's essentially user consented. And that's incredibly important, I think, when you're building biometrics.
Yeah.
So on the multimodal side of things, I completely agree. I mean, you have to have this. But you know, the challenge with all of these biometrics is, people are putting so much stake in them. The way these things are marketed and pushed to the public, it's like, oh look, your face recognition. Well, you know, Apple's got Face ID, so it should be great. But it can be defeated. And now we'll say, okay, well, face and thumb. Okay, great. So I got face and thumb, and somebody defeats that. And at some point, am I going to walk into like a little cubicle and have everything inspected in order to get to the right biometric? You know, the other thing about probabilistic is, as you know, 99% times 99% is not 99%. And the more things we have, the weaker and weaker it gets. And so this is a challenge. And I'm a fan of biometrics, like early in the history of doing it for a particular application, but long term I never like it because the technology catches up quickly enough that it gets defeated or it gets more challenging. So I'm hopeful, but I'm a little skeptical.
Well, I mean, all security is an arms race, right? This is from the instant, go back to the Stone Age. It's always going to be an arms race, and hopefully the good actors stay ahead of the bad ones. And that's also partially where I think where Silicon Valley and like-minded innovators with the Silicon Valley mindset, but in other parts of the world play a role.
Well, this is one of the things that we also have to be mindful of, though, is decentralized storage situation. So how do we not create decentralized honeypots? And then also comply with regulations that are going to say where you have to store certain things.
Exactly.
So this is a
so exactly that. Exactly that. I don't know how other folks are experiencing this with their businesses, but one of the challenges we face is we're trying to not get into the surveillance capitalism business, right? You want to be in the business where you're assisting people as they go through a journey, you're giving them access to things, but not essentially being incentivized to collect more and more and more information and always share more information. And so we've even had conversations now with privacy advocates and with government saying, look, your regulations require each bank to store on file all of these records every time there's a new account created. Can't we restrict it to just, let's say, these 3 things? And plus, with a biometric check, isn't that enough to open up a $100 account or a $1,000 account? And the problem is they're looking at old models. They're looking at old models, let's say from the US or Europe, that says, well, that's how it's been done for 100 years, so that's how we need to keep doing it. So the regulators also have a role to play, not only in regulating technologists, but actually in reducing the data storage requirements on consumer and financial services.
Yeah, but I'll give you the other side of it from the regulator's perspective, which is really hard to put together. They look at it and say, look, the fraudsters are going in and saying, hey, you don't need more information about me. You only need 3 things, and I got them. And so now they're viewing the world from the perspective of that side of it. And so this balance of good and bad. Look, for everything we talk about in the privacy world, and we say, look, things have gotten out of hand, and people are really using this in the ways we never expected. But a lot of good things happened along the way. And we kind of were suckered into the good things because, hey, you don't have to pay for any services you use. And so, here, put more data in, you don't have to pay for it. Hey, that's really cool. I would want to keep track of my whole family and all my friends. That's a great idea. Yeah, I'll put everybody I know's name, and hey, look, I'll even tag their photos because it makes sense. And so I think that this is the challenge. We are living in a very difficult place to balance, and we're trying to figure it out, and regulators are not helpful in some cases, but they have a different job to do.
At the risk of going backwards in the conversation, I'll actually say this is where I think blockchain can play a role. So obviously in the United States, yeah, I mean it's true, right? If you don't need to store everything, but you need to know who's attested to what at what time. And if you've got a good authentication solution, then you can go back and say, okay, well these things were attested to at some point in time. Now I don't need it. And actually, this is I think partially what you guys are doing here with Marketplace. In Africa and in other markets, there's a company called I think it's called Cambridge Blockchain. It's an unfortunate name, but it's specifically focused on trying to create a similar marketplace where attestations can exist without banks having to store all that information over and over again. So I do think yes, blockchain has a role to play.
So, all right. One last thing on biometrics. My biggest concern with biometrics is you don't know when you lose it. So I know when I've lost my ID. I know when I've lost a passport. I know when I've lost a device, a fob. I don't know when I've lost my biometrics. And that's one of the challenges here too.
We're working on that.
That's coming. All right, we're going to now turn this over to the audience for a minute here, because I'm sure there's some questions. There's been a very lively discussion, and I'm sure there's some good questions out here, as there always are at FinTech Silicon Valley. So let's go ahead and take some questions here.
Hey, thanks guys. I love hearing you kind of all chat about everything. Staying, I guess, on the theme of blockchain, I think when people normally talk about it, they're talking about a fully distributed ledger. But do you guys have any attitudes about distributed versus centralized versus decentralized in terms of being more bullish or less bullish on those?
decentralized. For me, it's all about distributing content, about having it decentralized. To me, the fact that so for example, if you look at the state of California, who recently made marijuana, cannabis legal last year, they require all these dispensaries to create more honeypots. So now everybody goes in, has to show an ID, gets stored in the honeypot, and these are for small dispensaries that I'm guessing any hacker that wants to target them could probably get in pretty easily. And these guys, they're not an industrial strength company like an Apple or Google or Facebook, but developers can easily get into these things. And to me, it's if we had these things decentralized, it'd be a hell of a lot better.
I'm going through a very difficult philosophical period of my life, where, you know, having lived in China for 6 years and now being here for 7.5 years, I've been like, what system would I prefer to be in, right? And I won't go into the dramas of my thinking around that, but, you know, in some cases there are advantages to have a central system that works well. And I think we debated a lot about the misappropriation of data by the Chinese companies and what's happening in China, and is there an arms race on AI? Of course there's an arms race on AI, and they have a ton of data, by the way, and they're very good. So there's a lot of this stuff happening, but I do think there's an element, you know, having lived in China, having friends there, you know, my ex-wife being Chinese and being someone that sort of went from being sort of almost against the regime to then saying, well, actually there's value to some of the stuff they're doing. I think we have a misunderstanding of a lot of the trust equation that happens in China, and why in some cases it might make sense for the government to be involved in saying this person has bad credit score, this person should not be allowed to travel because they have an ongoing debt to a tribunal and therefore to another person of something. And again, we oversimplify because we're the Western countries, right? And we've been around for a while. They haven't, of course. They haven't been around for thousands of years. And so, you know, in some ways I think we miss the point. So to your question, I think it's horses for courses is where I'm heading. I haven't really figured it out, so my philosophical debate is still ongoing. But I did feel, for example, much safer in China than I do here. I did feel that in China there are many elements of my respect and my privacy that I don't have here for sure. I do think there has been a misappropriation of privacy in the US, and not only because of private companies, but also because of government agencies. We haven't talked about the NSA and a bunch of other stuff, right? So in some ways, you know, what they're doing sometimes is, you know, reprehensible as a government, the Chinese for sure, but there's also a lot of stuff that they're doing that, you know, to be very honest, we've been doing it, right? So I'm a little bit more philosophical. I think it's horses for courses. There's going to be systems that need to be necessarily centralized. There are going to be things that need to be necessarily distributed.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack and say that when you say decentralized, I have a very hard time with that word in the context of blockchain. First of all, is the development of the software that's being used centralized or decentralized? Are the people who are running the mining operations centralized or decentralized? What does decentralized mean? Is it that there is more than one person involved? Is there 2 people? Is that decentralized? Is it 5? Is it 10? So I think we get lost or caught up in these terms because something about them sounds interesting and worth pursuing. But you really have to come down, because when you start to look at the different blockchains, they each play on a spectrum of this decentralization, centralization question. As far as centralization, the question you have to ask yourself is, why would I want a blockchain for centralized anything? In other words, that's not what it was designed to be. If it's centralized, just use a database. It's faster. There's a lot of other things you can use that are much faster than blockchains. So the question on this decentralized thing is, what aspect are you hoping to have decentralized? Look, when we talk about solutions like what Smile is doing with respect to having the data sitting in the person's device for looking at this, and I think on FIDO might have something like this as well, that's a decentralized model. It's decentralized at the person level, not at an institutional level. So really dig into that when you want to think about it, because I don't think, and like you said, there's different models will work for different things, but it's a match of the problem and the solution that you really want to get right.
Yeah, of course, and I'm not sure about, I mean, obviously not every blockchain is decentralized.
Right.
I don't know about Cambridge blockchain. They're probably not. No, I
I
have
don't
no
know
idea.
about them either. I just someone mentioned them to me.
Well, I love the name.
I know.
Is Bitcoin centralized?
And Bitcoin, I would say, is if we take a page from the SEC and say things need to be as decentralized as Bitcoin, then I think we're okay, right? Because I would argue that Bitcoin is very well decentralized.
Well, but then when you have 80%, of the mining being done by one country, how decentralized is it?
But here, look, if the two of us are mining, there's got to be no question that whether we're both in the U.S. or not, I don't care. He's not my, nobody I know.
Right,
We're not
that's right.
colluding, right? And
No,
so
you're right.
I think that because it's in a country doesn't make it a centralized situation.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, another question out here. Let me take him in the back here since. There you go.
Thank you. Julian Seviano from Promontory Financial Group. So we advise a lot of clients on financial crimes compliance issues, and you were just touching on this issue towards the end. Obviously, when people transact through the financial system, they need to be tracked in some way, right? So I was wondering, I wanted to get kind of the panel's ideas about how digital identity can help us protect or preserve some level of anonymity, but at the same time, keep the bad actors out of the system.
Okay, how do you balance the two? Who wants to start?
Sorry,
with
can we
that?
throw a question back to him for a second?
Yeah.
How does that happen in cash? How does that happen in cash?
Yeah, well, it doesn't, right.
Right. So again, this is a good
How
question.
it happens is you stop it from getting into the financial system up to a certain point.
Yes.
Right.
Good. So I think sorry, I may rephrase, but I kind of feel like that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
So I don't know what, I'm sure this is a hot topic and maybe a controversial one, depending on your perspective. But I think Libra has introduced a really interesting conversation about what is the nature of money and who should control how it gets transacted. And I loved one of David Marcus's responses to this concern about fraud and money laundering. It's like, well, how do you think cash changes hands? How is that tracked? And I think I would love to see a world where something like Libra exists. I'm not sure if Facebook is the right company to birth this into the world, but at least they seem to be taking, a more collaborative approach, right, to bringing people to the table and not having this simply be a Facebook currency. And quite frankly, it's the only way it could ever work is to actually have this be, a more distributed governing body. But it is still a permission ledger if you kind of understand what they're doing, right? So the idea is that there still is a point of entry or exit from those ramps where someone has to decide whether you get in or out. And in theory, and of course this would fit really neatly into the world that we're trying to be a part of, is you have some sort of KYC check on the entry ramp or on the exit ramp, and certainly for any transactions that would meet certain criteria, right, above a certain amount with a certain frequency. So I actually think that a Libra world would actually certainly empower the markets that we're operating in, where, the Zimbabwean currency has been a disaster, absolute unmitigated disaster. And you've got other people who are operating in countries where their currency can be devalued by 10, 20, 30% in a year, and they can't always predict. And so having alternative currencies that you can do business in is actually quite useful. But yes, there is still a need to have some sort of KYC check on the on-ramps. And I would love to see something like Libra actually succeed in that.
I could add one point to that. So I think KYC is overweighted a bit, and I'm a KYC provider. You got to have continuous monitoring. So there's concept of behavioral monitoring is an old school concept in fraud and what have you. KYC is just one gate, and the higher you put the gate, the less people get in, and then your marketing people will yell. It's a reasonable check, but I think it only goes well when you have a strong behavioral or continuous authentication model in the back end, because that's where you really get the context. And you're going to find the people over and over. So if you're just looking at the front door, you're going to miss the windows, the roof, the burrowing under. You got to really bring that aspect to it. So I think identity in this case is incomplete of a solution when you think of the full life cycle of a transaction.
Also, when we move into digital currencies, the other issue is this, what I talked before about friction. This is a reduction in friction. And so the notion is we have to reintroduce friction, which is almost against everything we've just spent our time talking about, needing to keep this identity thing flowing smoothly and people being able to get on. So there's, again, head-to-head conflict between what we would want as a societal thing for good versus what the bad people also want, which is good for them.
I was going to say one thing. This is why, I can't emphasize this enough and how we almost came into this very late in the game. This is why user experience design is so important. Like, I don't know if people here in the audience or watching this, are aspiring designers, but being able to take these really complicated technologies and concepts and make them easily understood by consumers at scale is so valuable. And it's why the market cap of Apple is what it is. It's why their gross margins are 40% on hardware. But that kind of consumer empathy and understanding is, I think, how we're going to get to, as Mark alluded to earlier, like get to the future, right? Get to where we want to get with actually being able to understand and use digital identities.
Hey, Mark, can I make one observation that while you were talking before, your biometric, hey Siri, came up. Siri came up while he was talking. He never said, hey Siri, but it did come up. So just my point on biometrics, still a little ways to go.
Unintended consequences.
I do think there's an element in our discussion in answering your question, which is, what are the boundary conditions on who's a good actor and a bad actor, right? I mean, we go back to companies that were incredible companies for the success of this country, etc., that today would be seen in a dark light, right? Companies that manufactured cigarettes, etc., etc. So in some ways, the bad actor, good actor, and again, I am a moralist. I have a notion of moral that is my own, and I respect notions of moral around me, etc., etc. But in some ways, there's that element, and that shifts over time, which makes the discussion a little bit more complex as well, right? Because there might be people that actually had proceeds coming from very, very, very bad sources that do something actually good with that capital. And there might be people that get, capital from incredibly good sources that do something really bad with that capital. So in some ways, that's always been for me a little bit the issue with the financial services dimension to this. I think it's sort of linked to other elements like taxation, etc., not so much sometimes to the actual ethics of it, which should be the purpose of it at the end. So, at least, again, back to my philosophical period.
All right, I have time for one quick one here.
Is there any sort of light at the end of the tunnel in regards to regulatory anywhere in the world where, for example, where a regulatory agency would actually respect some sort of a trust framework that you have set up, where somebody might, for example, KYC over here, and that's digitally onboarding a retro identity, and then that's respected somewhere else, and that's okay by the regulators? Is there any examples of any signs of this happening anywhere?
Yeah, GDPR. So GDPR, you've got two notions. One is the EU, but then separately, they have whitelisted certain countries that they feel respect the same level of privacy as they do for their citizens, and they have reciprocal agreements to move data between them. But that is for that particular purpose.
Yeah, I mean, this debate is happening right now in parliaments in Africa, and I think it's a really interesting one. And there are thoughtful voices on both sides about inclusion versus data privacy and citizen protection. There's actually bills right now in both Kenya and in Nigeria that have gone through a variety of different iterations around how national identity information is going to be handled. So it's a live topic right now in a lot of other markets around the world. Unfortunately, not in the U.S. Congress.
All right, I think we're at the end here. Pamela, do you want to say a few words here? Or before we close it out, let me again thank the panel profusely for a great discussion tonight. Please give them a warm round of applause.
Thanks so much, everyone. And we've got half an hour now for networking, so go for it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Yes, I do like this. A month ago, yeah. Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, so I could drop